Today we're going to move into our second part of our quadratics unit. So in the last part we learned how to graph quadratic equations with our three different forms. In this middle portion, remember we're going to break it into three parts. So in this middle portion we're going to learn about some skills having to do with quadratics and when x is squared and what can happen there. And then in our last part we're going to use these skills to then solve quadratic equations. Today the two skills that we're going to talk about are foiling and factoring. To FOIL. FOIL is an acronym that means every letter stands for something, and it stands for first, outside, inside, last. It works well when we're multiplying parentheses of two things by two things. I don't particularly like it as an acronym because it's not extendable. So in our next chapter, in chapter 6, we're going to look at multiplying a parentheses of two things by a parentheses of three things. And then the idea of foiling doesn't really work. Really all foiling is doing is distributing. So when it says first, what we're going to do is multiply the first thing in each parentheses by each other. So that gives me x times x, which is x squared. Then outside is really still just distributing that x and multiplying it by the outside thing or the end. So that gives, remembering signs, a negative 9x, because negative 9 times x. Then insides takes the 4 and multiplies it by the x. And that would be positive, because it's a positive 4 and a positive x. And then the last takes the 4 and multiplies it by the negative 9, which gives negative 36. Okay? So the acronym FOIL means multiply the first things, the outside things, the inside things, the last things. Okay? And it works as an acronym. If that helps you remember, that's fine. But really what's happening is we're just distributing. Okay? We're taking the x and we're distributing it to the second group, and we're taking the 4 and we're distributing it to the second group. Now we haven't done anything with that negative in the front, so our next step is going to be distribute that to each of these things that we got from foiling. So that's going to become a negative x squared, positive 9x, minus 4x, positive 36, and then combine any like terms. So negative x squared plus 5x plus 36 is our final answer. Okay. So if there's anything in front of the parentheses, we just let it hang out while we do our foiling or our distributing, and then distribute that through to everything, and then combine any like terms. Questions? Okay, so we're going to multiply the first things in the parentheses. X by x is x squared. Then the outside things in the parentheses gives negative 5x. The inside things gives plus 1x.
Wait, what are the outside things?
The outside would be like the very first thing and the very last thing. So the outside of the group, considering like the middle would be inside.
So x would be inside and 1 would be outside.
Well, it depends which x, because there's a couple of x's in here. So that very first x and the negative 5 are the outside things. So the outside edge is the group. And then the 1 and the x from the second group would be our inside things, because they're in the middle of the group. And then our last would be the 1 and the negative 5, which gives negative 5. Okay. If thinking of the acronym FOIL helps you, that's fine. But again, I like better just thinking about take the x, pass it out to everything in the second group, take the 1, pass it out to everything in the second group. Because that's really what we're doing, and that will be a more extendable idea when we go into our next chapter of material. Then we're going to take this negative 3 that's in the front, and we're going to distribute it or pass it on out to everything. So that gives us negative 3x squared plus 15x minus 3x plus 15, multiplying each of those answers by negative 3. And then combine any like terms. So the middle two are like terms, which combine to give a positive 12x. Questions? If you have a parentheses squared, what does squared mean?
Times 2. I mean, times itself.
Times itself twice. So we cannot just square each thing inside the parentheses. Okay? We're squaring the whole parentheses, which means we need to multiply the whole parentheses by itself. So what we're going to do is rewrite it as an x minus 1 times an x minus 1. And the 3 and the plus 8 are just going to tag along. Okay, squared means times itself. So we're going to rewrite it 2 times multiplied together. And then we're going to FOIL. When we FOIL, we let that number in the front just hang out. And we're going to take those two groups and multiply first, outside, inside, last. Or distribute the x, gives x squared. Keep distributing the x gives negative 1x. Distribute the negative 1 gives negative 1x. And distribute again gives positive 1. And that's where you stop. Because then that plus 8 is just going to tag along. We're only multiplying those two groups by each other.
What did you do to get the step 2?
I FOILed the two parentheses together. So I distributed the x to both parts of the second group, and then I distributed the negative 1 to both parts of the second group. Or the first, outside, inside, last. Then we're going to distribute that 3 that's in the front of the parentheses to each part of the parentheses. So it's going to give 3x squared minus 3x minus 3x plus 3. And then that plus 8 just keeps tagging along. You only distribute through to the end of a parentheses. You don't keep on distributing to that. And then lastly, we're going to combine up any like terms. So the 3x squared is the only thing that's an x squared. But then for x's, I have a couple of things to put together and make minus 6x. And for my constants, I have a couple of things to put together and make plus 11. When we are doing this, we are turning our equation from either intercept form, our first couple were intercept form where they had a couple sets of parentheses, into standard form, or this one was vertex form, and we're turning it into intercept form. Okay, so we're moving back and forth between those different forms that quadratics can take. Questions? Alright, so first step is to rewrite as that squared thing multiplied by itself. Then we leave the 1/2 alone for right now, and we leave the minus 3 alone for right now. But we're going to take those parentheses and FOIL them or distribute them through. So I'm going to take the x and multiply it through. Gives x squared plus 2x. And take the 2 and multiply it through. Gives 2x plus 4. Then I'm going to take the 1/2 and multiply it by each of these things now. Stopping at the end of the parentheses though. So that gives me 1/2 x squared plus x plus 2. And the minus 3 just tags along. And then combine like terms. 1/2 x squared, put together the x's, makes plus 2x. And put together the constants, makes minus 1.
If you do 0.5x squared, is that okay?
Yep, because it's a clean decimal, 0.5 is okay. questions on foiling? Factoring is the opposite process of foiling. Factoring, we begin with something in standard form where it's just all added together, and then we want to turn it into intercept form where we have two sets of parentheses multiplied together. So this is the backwards form, the backwards thing of what we were just doing. In foiling, we were taking two parentheses and multiplying to get rid of parentheses. In factoring, we want to turn this thing into parentheses. So here's some step-by-steps on it. The first thing we're going to do is check to see if there's a number or a variable that divides evenly out of everything in the problem. So if all of the numbers divide by 2, we want to take care of doing that first. Or if every single term has an x in it, we want to take care of doing that first. Then we're going to set up two parentheses with an x in the front of each. We're going to make a list of numbers that multiply to be c, which is the constant number at the end. And we want to pick the pair that in some way adds up to be b, which is the middle number. And then we're going to assign our signs to it, pluses and minuses. So first thing we always want to check is, do all of the numbers divide by something, or does every term have a variable in it? So I've got 6 and 16, those both divide by something, but in the front there's just a 1, so there's nothing to do with that. The first two things have x's, but the last one doesn't, so there's nothing to do with that. So we're going to set up two parentheses, put an x in the front of each. We're going to make a list of numbers that multiply to be the c value. So 1 and 16, 2 and 8, 4 and 4. Then I could say 8 and 2, but that's really the same thing as 2 and 8, so you don't have to list it again. Okay. Now we want to pick the set that in some way I can make the middle number, a -6. By adding or subtracting, I need to make a -6. I could do that with a +2 and a -8. Those would add up to a -6. But that's a problem. Because what would they multiply to be? -16. And we need a +16. So are there any other options in the list that will work? Can I make a 4 and a 4 into a 6? Can I make a 1 and a 16 into a 6?
No.
Nope. That means this one is actually not possible. We can't do it. So you have to be really careful of the signs there. The numbers worked, but the signs didn't work. So that one's not possible. So in this one we look, is there something that divides evenly out of every term? When we got a 2 and 15, those don't share anything. Does everything have an x in it? Nope, the 15 doesn't have an x in it. So then we set up our parentheses. Then we make a list of numbers that multiply to be 15. So I could do 1 and 15, or 3 and 5, and those are really our only options for a 15. So I need to pick the pair that in some way I can make a +2 out of. We're going for the middle number. So how could I make a +2 here?
-3, 5.
-3 and a +5 would give me a +2 when I add them together. Do they multiply to give me what I need? Yeah, they multiply to give a -15. So then I put the -3 in one of the groups and the +5 in the other group.
That's the answer.
That's the answer.
That's all.
We're just turning the standard form into intercept form. We're breaking it down into parentheses. So we look in here. Is there something that divides evenly out of everything? 5 and 4 don't divide by any of the same stuff, and they don't all have x's. So we set up our parentheses, x in front of each. List of what we can multiply to make a +4. I could do a 1 and 4, or a 2 and 2. Need to pick the way that I can make a +5 when I add them together. +4 and +1. And those go in the groups, and it doesn't matter which way they go. It's So when we're grading homework, if I say the answer is x plus 4, x plus 1, and you have x plus 1, x plus 4, that's fine. Because when we multiply, order doesn't matter. We learned at the beginning of the year that that's called commutative. That we can multiply forward and backwards, and this does the same thing. So this one, is there a number that divides evenly out of every single term? 2. So what we're going to do is take a 2 and put it in front of a big parentheses and divide every term by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 18 divided by 2 is 9. 28 divided by 2 is 14. The 2 should not disappear. It is not gone. It is still a part of the problem. A lot of students will divide everything by 2 and then the 2 is just gone. Right? It needs to stay in the front of the problem. Now we're going to set up 2 sets of parentheses, still with that 2 hanging out in the front of the problem. We're going to make a list of what multiplies to make 14. So 1 and 14, 2 and 7. Those are our only options on that. So I need to pick the set that I can in some way make a negative 9 out of. 2 and 7. If I want a negative 9, I need them to both be negative. Does that still work to make a positive 14?
Yes.
Yeah, because a negative times a negative is a positive. So that's still okay, so we're going to do a negative 2 and a negative 7. And that whole thing is the answer, including the 2. Don't lose a constant if it comes out of everything. You could FOIL this back out the way we did the first problems, and you should end up exactly back where you started. So that's a way to kind of check your answers on these, is if you multiply them back out the way our first examples did, you should end up right back where we started. Questions? Is there something that divides evenly out of all of these? 3. So I'm going to take a 3 and put it in the front of a set of parentheses and divide every number by 3. So I get 1, 1, and 2. Then I'm going to make a list of numbers that multiply to make negative 2. Well, that's just 1 and 2. It's the only way to multiply and get 2. And hope that in some way I can make a negative 1 out of them. So how would I do that? Negative 1, the bigger one needs to be the negative. So I'm going to set up my 2 sets of parentheses, x in the front of each, plus 1 and minus 2. Questions? Yes.
Why did you, for the problem for this, why did you look for a number out of 9?
Yeah.
Or did you look at 9 or did you look at 14? Like,
They have to multiply to make the last number. So in the last problem I had to multiply to make 14, but add to make the middle number. So I had to add to make the 9.
okay.
Multiply to make the last, add to make the middle. One of the things that didn't happen on any of these, but that could happen, is let's say, for example, just seeing with this last problem, instead it was like a 3x cubed minus 3x squared minus 6x. As our first step then, we would want to divide by 3 because all the numbers divide by 3, but all of them also have an x, so we'd want to take that guy outside as well. So I would divide the numbers by 3 in the same way and get a 1, a 1, and a 2. But when I take one of those x's away, it's going to leave me an x squared and an x and no x's. Okay? So if the variable is in every single term, it should come outside as well as your first step, as well as anything that can divide evenly out numerically. If there's any letter that's in every single one of them, that letter should come outside as well. Okay? And then we would continue the process the same way. This is actually exactly the same problem now. Okay? Questions? For your homework, there are 4 problems in here on the notes. Don't do them on the notes because then you would have to hand in the notes and then you won't have your notes for tomorrow. So just go ahead and do those on your notebook paper along with the rest of your homework. But do those 4 problems. The book does not teach foiling or any sort of multiplying, distributing, anything. I guess they think that everybody learns that in Algebra 1 and is good to go, but I don't hold that belief. So I've got 4 problems in your packet for you to do that are about the FOILing and multiplying. And then from section 5.2 of the book, there are questions on factoring.